The contents of this podcast reflect the views and opinions of the host and do not constitute medical advice. Hello and welcome back to Long COVID MD. I'm your host, Dr. Zeest Khan, a licensed and board-certified physician navigating recovery from long COVID. Today we're going to talk about some of the latest news surrounding long COVID, acute COVID, and myalgic encephalomyelitis. Some of it is discouraging. All of it garnered significant backlash on social media. I'm going to explain why. In the second part of the episode, we're going to talk about how we take in bad news, how we process grief, how we can be educated even about things that bring us down without derailing our recovery. I'm going to tell you the ways that I personally approach news and navigate grief. Many of you will resonate with that because I don't know a single person with long COVID who is not dealing with grief currently or in the recent past. So let's get started. First, let's talk about the news items. The first one was that an NIH study was recently published in the journal Nature. It had a bunch of authors, and it was called Deep Phenotyping of Post-Infectious Myalgic Encephalomyelitis. This was a study that focused on our cousin, myalgic encephalomyelitis. The two main authors are not new to the world of ME/CFS and don't necessarily have the best reputations within the community of ME/CFS patients. The study looked for biomarkers for ME/CFS and did have some insights into the biological causes of ME/CFS and maybe the neurological causes of ME/CFS. I'm going to link the article itself in the show notes. I'm also going to link to journalist David Tuller's interview with a neuroscientist discussing the findings. David Tuller is a journalist who has focused on ME/CFS for quite some time. There is a lot of good things with this study, but there are some glaring problems. First, let's take the authors. Two of the authors, Brian Wallet and Avindranath, like I said, are not new to ME/CFS research, and they accept quite large grants from NIH to organize and execute studies for ME/CFS. They have both made problematic comments about what their opinion is on the etiology of ME/CFS and have alluded to the idea that this is psychosomatic. I'm sure their opinions are more nuanced, but that is the perception of patients with ME/CFS backed up with a lot of these researchers' own words. Two, let's talk about the methodology of the study. The problems with the methodology is that one, this study took 8 years. Two, the study size was only 17 patients with ME/CFS who underwent pretty comprehensive workups. The controls group was about 20 patients. If we continue at this slow pace, costly pace, and small sample size, it's going to take eons to find a solution to ME/CFS. And speaking of solutions, the study did not suggest or study any interventions or treatments for ME/CFS. It just offered other study ideas, okay? And then the last thing I'll talk about that was problematic with this paper was that it used a phrase to study ME/CFS patients called effort preference. And the gist of it is they asked sick patients and healthy patients to undertake a task. And patients with ME/CFS did not exert themselves as much as the patients who were healthy. So they didn't physically exert themselves as much. And if you have long COVID, or if you have ME/CFS, or if you have another disorder that requires you to pace, you realize that when you exert yourself more than you typically do, you have real consequences. You are in bed potentially for days or weeks afterwards, and it sets your recovery back. What is problematic about this phrase is that it is not really a medical term used in medical research. I found one study that used the phrase effort preference when studying business models and profits. That study questioned or tried to measure how much effort a CEO is willing to put into the company and the subsequent profitability of that company. I have never heard of the phrase effort preference in medicine. And if you dive a little deep into the source material for the studies, like all of the studies that they link, there was some pushback, even among the experts who were consulted for the study, on using this phrase. When a scientist says this group of people didn't complete a task because they chose not to, we read that, and the public can perceive that as just another term for somatization. This is a psychosomatic disorder. This is a disorder by choice, that we are not putting enough effort in because we choose not to. Our preference is not to exert ourselves. And what is reality is that when we exert ourselves, we have experience that we lose health. And when you combine this phrase, the fact that it is not a medical term, the fact that the authors have had or have made problematic statements about their intentions, you can interpret this as patient blaming, that we are at fault for our disorder. A step beyond that is we are making up our disorder. It is very aggravating that this language is used. It is demeaning also because it seems like a thinly veiled effort to code the term psychological or psychosomatic in a new cloth and think that we're not going to pick up on it. This is unfair. This is unjust. And it is understandable why there is so much backlash in the ME/CFS community against this paper. It is not unreasonable to assume from studies like this and the context around it, because again, context is really important, that the message is that the people in power, A, don't believe us, and 2, don't think our problem is important or significant enough to address quickly. Of course, we're going to be upset about this. Of course, we're going to be angry about this. Of course, we're going to be sad. Because this condition is not our fault. We are doing the best we can. If ME/CFS and long COVID were curable by effort, then all of us would be cured, or like 99% of us, I am sure. Because of everyone who I have met who has had ME/CFS or long COVID, they have tried everything at their disposal and have sought out help as widely as they possibly can. They have utilized every resource they have. They have taken huge risks to their financial stability and have suffered, real kind of damage and changes to their interpersonal relationships by trying to get better. So our effort preference is actually very high as a group, and for it to be dismissed as being low based on some simple tasks is really demeaning. So that was that study. The second piece of news was that the NIH Recover Initiative, which is the basket that the NIH created to study long COVID, the Recover study was refunded. It was funded with over $1 billion with a B, and that money was used up, allocated and used in studies, very few of which were focused on treatment strategies. These were mostly observational studies, and you can look back to the last episode to get more details about that. So the Recover study spent $1 billion. We don't have any treatments for long COVID from that $1 billion, and there wasn't any more money that was earmarked. And then recently, more money was earmarked to Recover, but it was $500 million over 4 years. And as far as I know, and if you know differently, please send me an email at longcovidmd@gmail.com. As far as I know, the parameters of the initiative have not changed. So this funding is still primarily earmarked for observational studies and is not, and treatments are not prioritized. Studying treatments for long COVID are not prioritized in Recover. So again, that is a lot of money, just like the NIH study on ME/CFS. That is a long period of time, because now in total that would be 8 years of Recover money, round 1 and then round 2, without a good chance of getting treatments out of it. So how can we not feel upset and discouraged when we hear this? And then this week, and this will be the last bit of the bad news, and then we'll talk about how to move through it. The Centers for Disease Control in the United States, which is the government public health institution, changed their guidelines for acute COVID isolation. And so they decided to suggest that people who get COVID infection should isolate for 1 day, 24 hours after they have a resolved fever, and if their symptoms are improving, and then they can go back about public life, whether that's work or school or whatnot. In the fine print, just as was in the fine print in the California initiative that this was based on, the fine print says that patients with COVID are still infectious for, we think, up to 10 days after their symptoms start. And we know that you can be infectious, you can have an asymptomatic infection still, and that you can be contagious while you are asymptomatically infected. How this new guideline changes the way Americans react or respond to a COVID infection, I'm not sure. I don't think in my pocket of the world that this is going to change the rate of COVID transmission significantly, because where I live, in my pocket of the world, people don't test for COVID anymore, and they go to work and go to school with symptoms. Of course, this is not everyone, but the standard practice that I am seeing among most people in my community is that people are not testing for COVID when they get sick, and they are treating COVID infections, therefore, as they would another cold or virus. They are going back into the public sphere as soon as they feel able to, and masking rates are low. That does not mean that this is an insignificant thing for the CDC to do. In my opinion, a public health agency's job is to reflect best practices based on science. And the best practice for COVID is to isolate until you are no longer contagious. And that is not what is being reflected by the CDC. The science around long COVID has not changed. Vaccines don't do a great job preventing transmission rates of COVID infection, although they have been shown to reduce severity of an acute COVID infection. The CDC has itself said that patients who are at high risk for adverse outcomes if they get a COVID infection, like patients who are immunocompromised, like patients who are already with pre-existing conditions, remain at risk for COVID. And the messaging around this new guidance can be read as those people who are at high risk, you guys need to still take care of yourselves and take extra precautions, but the rest of us don't have to. And because we're an agency that takes care of everybody, for most people, this is the right thing to do. And for those of you who are set up to fall severely ill with COVID, we can't do much for you. There was someone who started posting particularly obnoxious commentary on the CDC guidelines, and that was Ashish Jha, who is a physician and a public health expert who worked in the White House as one of the COVID czars. And his commentary, he's no longer a White House, person. But his commentary on Twitter, which was unasked for and long, said that this was the right thing to do. The new CDC guidelines were the right thing to do because we have great new treatments for COVID. We have a lot of vaccinations, and the incidence of long COVID is, quote, way down. So let's tease that apart. Because from where I sit, it's pretty easy to punch some holes in Dr. Jha's argument. Patients who are symptomatic with COVID or have symptoms consistent with COVID are not testing as frequently as they have in the past. Even if patients test positive for COVID, Paxlovid is not prescribed in every case, even in cases in which it might be appropriate. Paxlovid for many people is difficult to tolerate, so not everyone who even gets diagnosed and prescribed appropriately Paxlovid are going to finish the whole treatment. Metformin has been found in some studies to be helpful in acute COVID infection and in reducing the risk of developing long COVID. Many medical providers do not know this, and metformin is not being prescribed widely. So the argument that the general population has a bunch of new tools in their armamentarium to protect them from the sequelae of COVID is a bit misleading. I will say here, I don't know what interventions are now available for inpatients with COVID, those who have required hospitalization, those who might be in an intensive care unit. But for the general population, those who are sick at home, the idea that we as a population have so many more new tools to take care of COVID is misleading. So patients are still contagious. Patients aren't getting treatment for acute COVID at the rates they probably should, and patients can still develop long COVID. Ashish Jha saying that the incidence of long COVID is way down is based on data I do not have access to, nor did he provide. So I don't know where he's getting that information. And I want to point out that incidence and prevalence are two very different things when we talk about epidemiology, which is basically the statistics of public health. Incidence means new cases. Prevalence means existing cases. Long COVID has very low recovery rates. So the prevalence of long COVID is probably the same as it has been for some time, even if the incidence is low. I want to further point out that patients who even get a diagnosis of long COVID, let's assume they get a diagnosis of long COVID, do not have access to drugs to treat long COVID because there are no research-based drugs to treat long COVID effectively. Physicians and other medical providers are undereducated to recognize and diagnose long COVID symptoms when they see a patient walk through the door. Patients in the public don't have on their radar to think, oh, maybe I have long COVID, and go about their day. Diseases like ME/CFS and fibromyalgia have already been underdiagnosed, undertreated, and people in the medical profession have a bias against these patients because there is a perception that this is, quote, effort preference, that these patients just need to get tough. This is something in your head. This is a consequence of anxiety or depression. And the NIH study that Avi Nath and Brian Wallet authored further perpetuates this notion. So you can hear that I'm a little bit fired up about this because I wasn't significantly fired up about the CDC changes. It was whispered about for some time. And of course, the CDC is going to be influenced by, for lack of a better term, and I'm not going to get into it more, by politics and optics. But when we start making excuses, when people in power start making flimsy excuses to try to kind of gaslight us into believing that this is in our best interest, then it fires me up that the structures of power are trying to convince us that these changes are for our best interest and that we are not in harm's way, when the reality is you're not taking care of me and you're putting others at risk. So where do we go from here as patients who are in various degrees of health? Where do we go from here? How do we take in this information and how do we process it? How do we not let it become a really big roadblock to us without risking a setback to our health? So how do we do this? Where do we hold aggravation when we've read bad news? And how do we process it? How can we stay up to date on news about long COVID without getting so discouraged that we lose hope? I imagine we all process it differently, but I'll share how I do it. The first step I took in this big process is admitting that I am grieving. I want to say here that I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychiatrist, so please take what I say as a personal narrative, but it may resonate with you because I'm not the only one who is grieving, and I think it would be difficult, if not impossible, to deal with such a life change without grieving. I am grieving the loss of my health, my independence, my career, and in many ways, my sense of self. My grief does not overwhelm me, though, mostly because I've been working through it, but it does color the way I perceive the world and the way I take in information. For me, grief is not one emotion, but a set of feelings. So I am sad, I'm angry, confused, sometimes I'm resentful, sometimes I feel betrayed. Grief is an emotion that all humans experience if you live long enough in response to a loss. And if you've been diagnosed with long COVID, you may be experiencing it now. Grief is not something to be ashamed of. And it's also not something to ignore. Ignoring grief does not make it disappear. Instead, I think that ignoring grief allows us to be tricked by it. It tricks us into thinking that this is the end, that there is no hope, that the odds are stacked irreversibly against us, and no matter what we do, we're not going to be able to make headway. But those I think are tricks, right? That's an example of getting tossed by your emotions and letting your emotions override your executive functioning. So because grief can affect the way we perceive things, we can have strong reactions to things like discouraging news. I mean, even flippant comments people make might feel super hurtful. We're emotionally vulnerable right now. But at the same time, we want to stay informed. We need to stay informed. We're navigating a medical system in which we often know much more about our disease than our doctors do. And we're very motivated to recover. We're not just grief-stricken zombies. We're ambitious, we're tenacious, and we're courageous. So how do we do this? How do we read tough news without panicking, without raging, and without subsequently crashing? Because that's really what I'm trying to avoid. I'm trying to avoid a post-exertional malaise crash. I'm trying to avoid a worsening of my symptoms. It takes away my time. It takes away my days. So I'll explain how I do this. And I have a multi-step process that I do pretty regularly, so much so that it's kind of innate now. And as I explain this, I want you to keep in mind that because my main priority is recovering my health, and because my main priority is maintaining a healthy relationship with my husband and children, I do every action centered on these two goals. My priority is my health and my family. I want to do many, many more things. I care about many, many more things, but I can only consider doing those things if my health improves and my relationship with these people is safe. I want you, as you listen to this process, to think about what your priorities are. Around what are your actions centering? What are your main priorities? Step 1 is to learn enough about the issue, but not too much about the issue. In medicine, we use a term as low as reasonably necessary. We generally use it when we talk about invasive interventions or even exposing patients to radiation. If we need information to guide our care, how can we get that information in the safest way possible? So, for example, if someone's arm is hurting, we could x-ray the whole arm. But it's less harmful to examine the patient and focus on the part of the arm that hurts. We want answers, and our goal is to find answers while doing as little harm as possible. So in this example, instead of exposing the patient to x-rays for their whole arm, we limit the x-rays to the wrist, and that is radiation that is as low as reasonably necessary. I apply this concept to my consumption of news. Information is good, but what information is good? That's what we have to ask ourselves. What is important for me to know? So in this example, we're using long COVID. Okay, so I want to know about long COVID, but what about long COVID? In my news and social media feed, I see long COVID discussed as opinion pieces. I see research updates. I see politicians' talking points. I see what others with long COVID are trying. I see advocacy groups organizing. So you might be seeing much of the same. So spend a moment thinking about what long COVID topics would be helpful to you right now. Are you looking to network with other people who share your experience? Are you looking to bring treatment ideas to your doctor? Are you looking to make systematic change and do advocacy work? Identify what you are looking for and edit your feed accordingly. So now that you've curated your feed for certain topics, let's sift through your feed once more and pay attention to the way different posts make us feel. What makes you feel curious? What type of posts make you feel sympathetic? Which type of posts make you feel validated? What make you feel like you just got dumped on? What makes you angry? What makes you feel powerless? What types of posts do you think will help you in your established goals? Now, this is very personal and it can change as you change. Sometimes those posts of despair help you feel validated. You crave community, you crave understanding. For some people, those posts of despair are distracting and make you feel sad without giving you anything without any significant benefit. So like and dislike and mute posts as you see fit. There is no judgment here from me or anyone else that matters. This is personalized for you. But the important thing is to focus on these questions that only you can answer. What information am I looking for? Okay, next, now that you've curated your feed even more, you might see a headline come your way that somebody linked to, and they linked to it and they wrote a comment that, grabs your attention. Like, this is important. This is terrible. This is fantastic. And they write a quick summary of why they think it's important. My suggestion is to read the article. If you think that's identified as an important thing for you to know, that's in line with your goals, don't take the headline at face value, and certainly don't take somebody else's opinion at face value. So I would read the article or use, sometimes we can't read through a whole article because we don't have the capacity to, and I've certainly been there. So use sources that you trust to help explain the information. This could be, sending it to a partner or a friend. Hey, can you read this and tell me your take on it? This could be somebody who you have vetted online, whose opinions you tend to find helpful, and see if they've, made a summary of it. Don't take the headline at face value because we are in a transitioning market where clickbait is really profitable. And oftentimes there's a lot more to the story than the headline. A lot of times, without going off on a totally different tangent, the headlines are generated by AI to be most clickbaity, and the story might not have, might be a lot more nuanced than what the headline suggests. The third step is in general to limit your consumption of the information, both of one particular story and, more broadly, the time you spend scrolling. So let me talk about this a little bit more. This is where the idea of as low as reasonably necessary needs to be followed. At least for me, I really need to consume as little as reasonably necessary. The phrase as little as reasonably necessary can be reworded as just enough. Once I think I have a decent understanding of a news story, especially if it's a discouraging or sad development, I stop looking at it. Once I know enough information, I have to accept it's enough information. I am particularly careful about this when it involves news about human conflict. I do not watch videos of war tragedies. I do not watch videos. I personally have worked in surgery for nearly 20 years. I have worked in trauma surgery for a long time. I know what injury looks like. I know what injury to an adult body and a child's body looks like, and I don't need to see it filmed to understand the tragedy and the injustice. So I learn just enough to be educated and not so much that I don't want to say punishing myself because that centers the story around me, but I don't want to learn so much that the power of the story is overshadowed by my emotional response to it. And ultimately, if my goal is to continue progress in my recovery, I don't want to set myself up for a deep sadness, a deep feeling of powerlessness that might lead to a crash. I want to make this clear. Doom scrolling does not make you better informed. They are not the same thing. And you can be informed without excessively repeating the shock of the headline. So let's use the example of the response to the NIH study on ME/CFS and the new CDC guidelines. When I was scrolling, I use Twitter primarily. When I was scrolling, I saw very quickly that patients with ME/CFS and long COVID were upset about these changes. I learned pretty quickly why they were upset, how they were interpreting it, what their stance was that made them upset. It was very justified. I learned my next step was to look at the NIH study and look at the CDC guidelines using sources that I generally trust and rely on. I learned as much as I needed, and then I stopped reading commentary on how terrible the changes were because I learned as much as I needed. So let's review before we get to the final steps. 1, identify your goals. 2, curate your feed to match those goals. And 3, spend only as much time on the topic as is necessary to understand it. The last 2 steps are important, and they are to analyze how the information affects you and consider ways to address it without risking a setback. Let's take the changes in the CDC COVID guidelines for an example again. In my corner of the world, many people do not test for COVID when they or their family get sick. People are in public sick. Masking rates in my corner of the world are low. So I took in this information. I am applying it and trying to analyze how this is going to affect me. And for me personally, I think the CDC guideline change is going to alter my risk for contracting COVID minimally. The subsequent action I'm going to take is I'm going to continue protecting myself as I have been. Beyond my personal sphere, the guidelines can affect people I care about, right? it potentially broadens health disparity in marginalized communities and among immunocompromised populations. Alternatively, even if I don't know or care about anyone else, maybe I think the change is wrong on principle. Maybe I think this is the wrong way for the organization to act. What do I do with this issue? What do I do with this feeling? Because this injustice is heavy and it can feel overwhelming. So how do I respond to this event that affects me, that affects people I care about, when I am struggling as it is? So what I'm going to offer is not a comprehensive solution. It might feel inadequate, but I do it nonetheless, and actually I would argue it's empowering. So I assess my resources and I take an action. Assess my resources. I assess my energy, my finances, my social network. What resources can I use to respond to this? Do I have enough energy to attend a rally? Do I have enough energy to write an email? Do I have money to donate to an organization that aligns with my values? Is there a way I can share this information with others for the sake of education or in order to ask others to take an action on my behalf or show them how this affects them personally? Identify what you can do with the resources you have. Do that thing, and I suggest put it down. It is true that your action alone is not likely going to solve this big problem, but by taking an intentional action, you have become better educated on the situation. You have impacted the situation, even in a small way, and you have maintained your health in the process. And you've got to learn how to be okay with that. It is impossible for me to sit here and tell you not to care about news items, but there is a difference between caring about a news item, taking an action about an issue, and perseverating on an issue. Perseverating is a type of obsessive behavior in which you get hyper-focused on an issue and you can risk getting increasingly emotional about it without necessarily intervening. This does not help your health. Neither option, perseverating or taking a small action, is going to necessarily change the big game, but one is a distinct action in which you have a benefit because you've been educated about something, and the other one is potentially causing you harm. The truth is, we have limited energy. The truth is, we always had limited energy. We always had finite resources. We were never able to control everything in the world or even everything in our own lives. And just as we need to pace our bodies, we must find methods to remain emotionally steady. Just like physically pacing is very challenging, this emotional pacing is challenging, and it does not mean that we become zombies or that we no longer take interest in issues. It's not the same thing as not having a stance or being apathetic. That's the word I'm looking for. But the thing is, our instinct is often to do the most in response to something, even if that is like get angry the most. But that reaction can have significant ramifications for you now that you have post-exertional malaise or this disability. So you've got to personalize these methods for yourself if they sound like methods that could be useful to you. They need to be based on your values, which, is an exercise that takes some time. They need to be based on your goals. You need to identify your resources, particularly, you need to assess your physical energy and your bandwidth, your energy envelope. All of these variables change because we are ever-changing people. So I want to clarify that this method is different than unchecked optimism. It's not toxic positivity. It requires you to focus on what is most important to you and take a realistic inventory of your life as it currently is. Many of us, if we listed what's most important to us and then we list where we spend most of our time, we can see a mismatch. Unless we're intentional, we can steal energy away from what's most important to us and dump it somewhere that in the end of the day wasn't that important to us. If we spend more of our time in line with the things that we value the most, then we're more likely to be happy. I'm going to link an episode from the podcast Happiness Lab that talks more about this. So I myself am personally practicing the ability to recognize what things are within my sphere of influence and what things are outside my sphere of influence. What do I have control over? What is outside of my control? I am not the first person who has done this. And I'm also practicing an appreciation for small actions. I used to do lots of big things. Like many of you, I can't do as many big things. And it was easy for me to think, well, I can only do small things, so what's the point? Now I've reframed that, and I think if I can only do small things, then let me do the small things. Small and big are value judgments. That is a whole other topic for discussion that we could have about why we value certain actions differently. But I want to convince you that the actions that are available to you are worthwhile. Your life is meaningful. You cannot solve every problem, and you can help impact some problems. You can be educated, and you don't need to know everything. You can receive bad news without becoming controlled by it. And all news is not going to be bad. I hope this makes sense. As always, I hope this was helpful. If not, I hope it made you curious. Send me an email and let me know what you think. You can always reach me at longcovidmd@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at Dr_Zeest. That's DOCTOR_ZEEST. Like and follow this podcast, Long COVID MD. Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Dr. Zeest Khan, and until next time, bye for now.